So, my name is Jen Kiaba, and today I'm going to be talking about my story in the context of something that we've been talking about a lot here. So, fear, our creativity, and how we forge connection through it. So, a little bit about me. I'm a fine art and portrait photographer, and I'm also the eldest of 5 children who was born into the Unification Church. And if you're not familiar with the group, it is a group that the media calls a primary example of a cult. It had its heyday in the 80s and the 70s. Reverend Sungmin Moon over here was the founder. He started it in Korea, and he's best known as the purveyor of mass marriages. However, church members believed he was the Messiah. They believed that he was the second coming of Christ, and that he had become so through his perfection, his personal relationship with God, and his marriage to the much younger Hak Shahan back in 1960. And after Reverend Moon's death in 2012, the church began to schism. So if you're familiar with the Sanctuary Church, they were the group that brought their semi-automatic rifles to a blessing ceremony in Pennsylvania earlier this year. And to understand what it meant to be in the Unification Church, I want to quote the author Catherine Barton, who said, "Growing up in the 1970s, the Moonies were the scariest thing that I knew." So in the decade that my parents joined and in the decade after when I was born, many parents were afraid of losing their children to this group. And because of that fear, they hired deprogrammers. So I grew up hearing stories of my parents' peers who were kidnapped, brought to slimy hotels for weeks on end, sometimes tied to a bed, while deprogrammers would read to them from the Bible, trying to extricate them from the group. So these are a couple of images of that time. So there's a protest outside of one of Moon's events, and then an SNL skit, Night of the Moonies, which is depicting deprogramming. It was very funny, but it's not funny. So my parents were strangers until they were matched by Moon in 1979. And a matching was when everybody who was a follower would gather, brothers on one side, sisters on the other, and Moon would point to a man, point to a woman, and you were engaged. So this is a picture of my parents' wedding in Madison Square Garden. Supposedly, Moon could see into your soul, into your ancestry, and he would pick the perfect spouse for you to help you heal God's heart and complete the providence. And that meant that sometimes people had a spouse that they didn't share a common language with. My parents were actually very rare in that they were both Americans. So my parents were married along with 2,000 other couples in Madison Square Garden in 1982. And I was the first of 5 children who were born into the Unification Church's second generation. We were called blessed children, and they believed that we were perfect, that we were born sinless, and that we were going to go on to heal the world and heal God's heart, which means no pressure, right? So, as a young child, my mother especially would try to import the importance of my identity on me. So she would tell me that I was born different and that I had a mission. And she would tell me I had to be very careful about who knew who I was, otherwise Satan would attack me. It was like being born with a secret identity and constantly being under threat by the outside and satanic world. So they thought that people would try to seek to corrupt me. And that meant that my younger siblings, myself, and other second generation, were taught that we could not really be in the world. And in order to achieve this, many members lived in communal living spaces or in tightly knit communities. Some members even set up their own schools so that children didn't have to fraternize with evil satanic children. The problem for me and my siblings was that we did not grow up near one of these communities. We were about 2 hours away from the closest church members. And so for many of our formative years, we grew up in a strange liminal space where we had to be in the world but not of it. And my parents constantly reinforced to me that I couldn't tell people who I really was. Otherwise, I would be attacked and deprogrammed. So these are some of the cultiest pictures that I have. These are of mine and my siblings' 8-day ceremony where we received our names and were dedicated to God. There we go. So this means that growing up, I felt a strong sense of otherness and disconnection from others. I moved through the world with a strong sense of fear initially only opening up and being vulnerable in those very few sanctioned spaces that my family and my faith allowed. And I strove to be included in every single church activity that I could because that was the only opportunity that I really had to be myself, supposedly. Except that I wasn't. I learned it was a performance. And as I grew older, I started to learn to see the cracks in the facade of my faith, and I began to question who I really was. And the only place that I let myself experience my feelings and explore my thoughts was in my heart. How many of you can relate? I did it in secret. I wasn't showing this to anybody, otherwise I would have been severely judged. Because in my upbringing, to question was to invite Satan, an evil spirit world, to attack you. So I figured that by my questioning at all, I must be inherently evil. And in order to drive away any of those thoughts, we were supposed to basically re-brainwash ourselves and go read Reverend Moon's texts, which I was very bad and didn't do. So, at 19, I found myself on a terrifying personal precipice. I was seriously considering that the Unification Church might not be the truth. But I was terrified of the outside world, and I was taught that it was evil. So the thought of leaving this safe community that I had grown up in was very scary. And additionally, at 18, I was almost an old maid, because in the church, we didn't date. It was completely platonic. We referred to everybody as brother and sister, and Reverend Moon chose our spouses. So, from the time I was born, I expected that my spouse would be chosen for me. And then news came. Reverend Moon, who was in his 80s at the time, had announced to everybody that after 4 years of having parents match their children, he was stepping in to do a matching, maybe for the last time. And I had, up until that point, had friends coming up to me being like, when are you joining the ring club? And they'd flash me their blessing rings. And I had other people saying, you better hurry, otherwise all the good ones will be gone. And I was like, that means I must not be one of the good ones. So, my parents sat me down and said, Jenny, if Jesus came to you and said, I have found your perfect spouse, what would you say to him? Now, how much more is Father? We were taught to call Reverend Father. And at that time, I didn't know how to say no. So this is a picture of the most terrifying day of my life, my wedding. And this was the breaking point for my faith. So, for the next 2 years, I found myself struggling to extricate myself from that marriage. And what I found was that instead of the community rallying to support me and save my marriage, they were turning their backs on me because I was breaking the blessing, which was about the second cardinal sin that we had. The problem was that the church taught us that to leave was to invite a very real death. I grew up hearing stories of traffic accidents, drownings, terrible diseases. So as I was leaving, I was afraid not only of spiritual death, but an actual physical death. And in the dangerous wilds of the outside world, I faced the difficult task of integration and reforming an identity. I was no longer a blessed child with a secret identity, so who was I? And I'm sure that many of you can kind of relate to this. After being rejected by the community of my birth, and a very real fear of being rejected by the outside world, I was afraid of being judged for who I was and what happened to me. So I went on with the performance that I had learned. I pretended like I was normal and nothing happened. And the only place that I felt comfortable speaking about my truth was in my art. But I felt fear and guilt in creating it. There we go. So, for years, I let fear silence me in my work. When my creativity began to edge into my truth, I would panic and shut it down. My fear was that in creating truthful work, I would no longer be able to be hiding and be safe. Slowly but surely, I began to edge myself into creating work that scared me, and I began sharing it. And the first time I shared my art, I literally almost blacked out in panic. I was at a workshop, kind of like this, and I slid my prints across the table to the woman across me, and she looked at my prints, and she was very quiet for a while. And I was like, oh God. And then she looked at me very sadly, and she said, these pictures remind me of me. And then she told me her story. And I realized that a new kind of connection could be created. So, when I began sharing my story and my work, others began sharing their stories and their work in return. A dialogue had begun to open up. And I began hearing that for others, in seeing my work, they found either the strength to break through in telling their own stories, or they accessed words that hadn't been able to find, or they just felt safe in talking to somebody about what had happened to them. So every single one of us here has a story that we feel defines us. And every single one of us here has probably been afraid to be vulnerable. Hands, anybody? Figured. So that means at one point or another, we've been afraid to share our work and share our truth, because the fear of rejection is so strong. So we as humans, we have an innate fear of rejection. It is built into our DNA, because at the times of prehistoric eras, it was literal death to leave the tribe and leave the safety of our society. We would die out in the wilderness. So it is still programmed into us, that fear response. Fear is literally trying to keep us safe. Authors, Simon Sinek also talks about the circle of safety that we feel like we need to exist within. So when we begin to explore outside of those comfortable parameters, fear is trying to shunt us back into the safe place so that we don't hurt ourselves or die. And the problem for us as artists is that many of us already exist on the fringes of that circle of safety. And so we're afraid that when we share our truth, we will be shunted completely outside of that safe circle. But oftentimes, what I find is that if we stay inside that circle, we never create our greatest work, and we just hide in fear. So, interestingly, I find that there's an irony in that. I also find that fear is a barometer for us. If we are edging into fear, we are edging into something that we want to create or we want to share. So I feel that they are intrinsically entwined. And I now have come to believe that when we create the work, that's for us. But once the work has been shared, once it leaves us, that's for others. Sharing the work is the vehicle for somebody else's story. So our work creates a bridge between ourselves and others. It helps them to feel understood and seen, maybe for the first time in their life. If we let fear win out, it means that we miss those opportunities for connection and for creating important work and for others to feel safe and seen. There we go. When we share our stories and our truths, we also give people permission to share theirs as well. So I teach with a nonprofit. We work with a lot of at-risk and inner-city students. Our whole goal is to get them full scholarships to college for art. And I begin every single class by telling them my story, because that for them gives them the permission to share their stories as well. It creates that safe space for them. In that, there is healing for them, and like I said, there is safety. I believe that we have an immense potential to create new and beautiful circles in which people feel safe and seen. Our truth can have the power to heal us and to create new tribes like this one that are in need of our message. So that is the work that I feel like Brooke has done for all of us. So I want to leave you with some encouragement. If you're feeling stuck in fear, seek out those initial safe spaces like this one. Just by being here, you have already taken that first step. And then you can begin to create safe spaces for others. Soon you're going to find, if you haven't already, and I'm sure you have by being here, that amazing connections can be created, like Ted was talking about, when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and move through fear to share and create connection. So I want to leave you with a question. What are you most afraid to create? Your fear might guide you to your greatest creative truth and connection. Thank you.